Hello and welcome to another Trench Crusade episode. Today we're looking at the Artillery Witch. She's become kind of a poster child for Trench Crusade, and I know that a lot of people have been asking for me to paint her, so without further ado, let's get into it. I've started off by having my 3D print attached to a base kind of fairly loosely with some super glue because I'm planning something a little bit more special for the base. But I'm starting off with a prime of black all over, but I'm not going to do a zenithal highlight today. So as I said, I'm going to do something kind of wacky for the base. So I gently peeled her off, trying not to break the resin. And then I've got these random kind of rocks and pieces of shale, and I love the pose, and she kind of comes across as like tiptoeing to me. So I wanted something very delicate, like the idea that she's summoning this artillery but kind of tiptoeing away across the battlefield. So I started off by gluing this kind of angular piece of shale down, and then I got these toothpicks and pieces of craft wood that I just broke up to represent fence posts, and I'm just gluing these into place with super glue. What I'm doing is at every stage I'm just kind of dry fitting just to make sure that I'm still on track. There's no parts of the model that are kind of like rubbing into each other or breaking the silhouette. I'm using my favorite wire from Gale Force 9. This is their barbed wire, but you can get this from most local hobby stores or board game stores. And I'm just gluing this into place. A lot of this will be kind of tied down once we start adding layers of paint and varnish and things like that. And I finished the model out by gluing her on her tiptoes here, and I'm really happy with just the overall look, and it just kind of comes across as kind of a delicate pose. I'm going back to the airbrush and just priming the rest of the base now. I could have probably saved myself a step and did this beforehand, but I got eager and just wanted to kind of mess with stuff, and I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with the base. To finish out the rest of the mud on the base, I'm using AK's Wet Ground, and I'm just kind of sponging this into place with this tiny spatula. This is also going to help kind of cement a lot of these rocks and fence posts into the base itself, because this will dry and just add another layer of adhesive. And then I'm also going to make sure that this is fully dried before starting to apply some paint. So to begin with, I'm going to be using Petroleum Grey from Scale Color, and I'm just dry brushing this on. There's not going to be too much of a difference here on top of the black. It is a very, very dark grey, but it's got just a little bit of warmth, kind of bluish hues to it, and that will really help just to kind of break away from that normal grayscale. And I'm going to mix in just a touch of neutral grey to start to build up the brightness and increase those highlights. I'm still dry brushing as I normally would, but just kind of gently, and I'm starting to ease off on the pressure as much, because first of all, it is delicate and I don't want to break it off of the rock that she's standing on. But secondly, the less pressure I apply, the lighter the highlight's going to be. And then finally, I'm just using pure neutral grey for my final highlight. I don't want to go any brighter than this because I don't want her to appear kind of shiny. So this is the brightest highlight that I'm going to do, and I'm just touching on certain areas. Next up, we're going to be using Ardennes green, and this is a great military green, kind of olive drab, for the artillery piece. So I'm not too worried about complete accuracy and just covering up every inch of this model. I'm just kind of throwing this on. I'm letting it just be a single coat, or just not filling in all the gaps and the dings and dents. I'm just kind of throwing this on for a single color for right now. In the concept art, she's fairly monotone, but I wanted to introduce just a hint of color, so I'm using a Decayed metal from Scale Color, and this is going to be kind of my base tone for the armor sections in her outfit. So anywhere that I feel like she has kind of a medieval armor section, like her arms and her head, I'm just going to throw this on first and really kind of let that get into all the creases, ready for a dry brush. And to do that, I decided to use plate mail metal from Army Painter's Fanatics range. And I'm just very, very carefully highlighting some of the more intricate details on the armor. I'm not worried about being 100% accurate, I'm just kind of letting the brush catch the sculpt. If I overspill, that's fine. It's so minute and you won't really notice it from kind of 2 feet away. I decided to switch to a dry brush for some of the bigger areas, so her kind of horns and some of the really, really small details on the gauntlets. I decided to introduce some more contrast, but for this I'm actually using Nuln oil, and rather than just kind of soaking the whole model in the shade, what I'm doing is just very selectively choosing kind of areas that would have a natural shadow. So around the seams of the armor, around the neck, and under the capelet. And then while that's drying, I'm going back in with a neutral grey and I'm starting to pick out some of the more finer details on her cape. So really I'm just letting the brush kind of pick up on all of these kind of tentacle patterns and just letting it pick certain highlights. I'm not too worried about just covering the whole model. And I also don't want to go too bright as well. I'm just letting it be kind of that neutral grey. I'm using very little pressure and just letting the brush catch that sculpt. You could mix some white into the neutral grey, but I decided to just use bright neutral grey. It's just a shade higher, and it's going to keep it more consistent than if I have to keep mixing in white. But now I'm using this for some select highlights. Again, I don't want the whole model to appear bright and shiny, so I'm really just using this for the edges of the cape and some of the kind of decal work that's a little bit more exposed. And then I'm using the bright neutral grey for the ruff around her neck. I'm looking for those natural high points on the model, not necessarily anything that would catch the light, but just kind of moments where the sculpt is a little bit more upturned. So for example, the corner of the capelet and around her knee. And then lastly, just picking out some of those edges on the detail work. Next up we have a speed metal, and this is a great highlight for kind of a normal gunmetal. So I'm using this for just some very key highlights on the armor. I don't want to go too crazy because this will really brighten up the miniature. So you can see I'm just kind of focusing on the horns and the rim around the waist and just kind of shining up the metalwork. My preferred white is Bold Titanium White by Monument Hobbies, and so I'm using this for the prep work on the smoke around the bomb. I went back and forth on the colors for the magic, but I decided on a kind of a shocking purple color. I think that would complement the darks of the grayscale quite nicely. So I'm prepping everything in white, including the seal on the artillery as well. We're going to be doing a lot of airbrushing in this next section, so if you don't own an airbrush, I would recommend maybe dry brushing. You won't get the same effect or the softness of the gradient, but you will get it to kind of catch those areas on the sculpt. So as you can see, I'm just prepping some more white here and starting to get that gradient that's ready for the next color. And for that, I'm going to be using Inktense Violet. This is actually a purple ink, and this is incredibly strong, so just be very, very careful. I'm barely touching the airbrush, and you can see it's really soaking the miniature and saturating that in that purple. So I'm just very, very carefully, just in bursts, choosing some areas that I want to hit with this very, very dark purple. And you can always stop at any point, you don't have to go overboard, so I decided to stop at this point, ready for the next colour. And for that, I'm using Kakophoni Purple, and so I've mixed this in with a little bit of airbrush thinner, and I'm just spraying this onto the origin of the magic, which is towards her palm. I'm being super, super careful not to get this on any other part of the model, apart from around her face, where there would be a natural glow. I've just threw in a couple of drops of white and mixed that just to kind of build up that gradient back up to a pure white. And now I'm switching over to a fluorescent red for the seal on the bomb itself. In my head I wanted the seal to be a different color, so I'm building this up to be kind of white hot. Here I'm using a fluorescent yellow. You could use any brand, this is just the one I had laying around, and I'm just letting that blend naturally through the airbrush. And here I'm finally going in with some Trollslayer orange. I switched back to the brush and I'm just tidying up that seal. I'm switching over to Yriel yellow and I'm starting to mix that into the orange and just introduce this yellow color, building up to eventually a pure white. And what this does, if I do this kind of slowly and in stages, is it gives the appearance that this seal is like really hot and has been kind of branded into the bomb itself. I mix this in with the orange and you can see I'm just tidying up those edges and smoothing that transition. And then finally I'm using some Dorn yellow and really punching in that middle section of the seal. The more saturated I can get this, the more vibrant and much more hot this was going to appear. I've mixed in some white into that Dorn yellow, and this will be kind of my final highlight just to really sell that this is on fire. I've gone back in with that Kakophoni purple and I'm starting to edge highlight around the cape and the gauntlets here. What this is allowing me to do is just get a little bit more control on the highlights rather than just leaving it to the airbrush to kind of overspray. This way I can kind of tailor how bright I want those bright points to be. And now I'm starting to tidy up some of the smoke leading towards her palm. I wasn't quite happy with how bright this was towards her hand. So I'm just using this to kind of emphasize that this is the origin of where this magic is coming from. And then just slowly building up to a kind of a high shine back onto the helmet, because if I use that dark purple, it's just going to kind of dull the shine on the face. I decided to add a couple of quick highlights to the bomb itself. So for this I'm using green sky, and I've mixed this in with the Ardennes green so it's not so drastic. And I'm just kind of sponging this on with an old brush. I want some of that gritty texture from my other Trench Crusade models, but I still want to be able to just catch some highlights here. For the rock that she's standing on, I'm just using a Mournfang brown. And you could really use any color at this point. I just kind of threw this on. I figured it looks a little bit rusty as well. This could be an old piece of a tank or something. And I'm using Baneblade brown for the sections of wood. I'm not too worried about being meticulous here. I'm just trying to get the paint on because we'll be applying a wash, and that will cover up a lot of this. For the wash, I'm going to be using Agrax Earthshade, and I'm just throwing this on all over the base, even the mud itself, and just letting it kind of sink in and just drag the overall saturation right the way down so that the focus is really on the artillery bomb and her face. I'm using a couple of the metallics that are still on the palette to add some more rust and grime to the barbed wire. And so I'm just kind of throwing this on, letting it catch the sections of the wire. And then finally I have this stirred earth acrylic paint, and this kind of dries into a really nice dry mud texture, and it works really well with the wet ground. So I'm just kind of splattering this on with an old brush and letting it just do its own kind of random patterns. What this also does is tie the elements of the base together in a nice subtle way that it doesn't just look like there's a rock sitting on top of some mud. And here she is. It must be the season of the witch. This really was one of the models that definitely sold me on Trench Crusade, and even though I went all in on New Antioch, I have been eyeing up this faction quite a bit. But anyway, what a cool model, what a great, quick and easy paint scheme. But as always, I want to know what you guys think. And if you played a match of Trench Crusade yet, I haven't had the chance to and I'm dying to try it. If you've enjoyed this video and you want to get stuck back into the trenches, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, like the video. A big thank you to the YouTube members, and I will see you all in the next one.